Okay. So, what is natural selection? Anybody? Okay. Survival of the fittest. What does that mean?
The stronger genes adapt and passes on.
Okay. The stronger gene, the more beneficial gene, actually, it doesn't evolve. It actually is a mutation, let's say a mutation. And that mutation, because it's so beneficial, individuals that have that gene, those are the ones that are likely to breed and pass on their genetic material to future generations. Okay, so let me write that down. Okay. Now, I think evolution by natural selection, I think selection is an unfortunate word. Because it kind of implies that someone or something is selecting for certain traits. And that's not true. What it is individuals with certain traits that match their environment, in other words, the cards they've been dealt, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So, in a sense, the environment is selecting individuals because they have the alleles that help them survive and reproduce more than other individuals. So we call it natural selection, but it's not a being that's actually going around selecting things, unless it's artificial selection like we do with selective breeding. Okay, is it possible to have natural selection without evolution, or evolution without natural selection? We'll start there when we come back, okay? So you can think on that. In fact, another thing, the top hat, we should have done something with it. I'm going to close the top hat for scientific method, and I'm going to open some top hat questions that pertain to evolution. Okay? Oh, okay. So if you get it right, you should still vote. Okay. Oh, I'm sure you did, but why don't you just do just only make it Okay, I need glasses.
When will you close it for scientific method?
When I get back to the office.
So today, in a minute?
Right now. Well, actually, no, 2 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Email me and I'll put it live. I'll talk to them, they really don't do a good job of it. What? No, at 2 o'clock. Yeah, yeah.
That's right, I did. I mean,
Okay, anything else? Yeah.
The slides that you put up, what do you use? What do you make the slides on?
Oh, let's see, PowerPoint.
Because what I like to do is print them and write on them.
Yeah.
But printing it,
Yeah.
it's gonna print the whole slides. So I was wondering if, like, is there a way you can post it, like, on Google Slides? Or if I email you, can you?
Why, you should be able to
Because
print,
when I print, if I click print, it prints it, like, the whole slide. 65 slides instead of 3 on a page. You know what I'm talking about?
oh, okay, I think you can actually,
I've tried doing it through my
Yeah.
It's not letting me. You have to do it because you're administrator.
right,
So
oh,
if I email you,
that's right,
yeah.
okay, yeah, I can do that,
Yeah?
yeah.
Okay.
Good,
I'll email you.
I'll do that. So you want like 3 slides per,
Perfect, so I
right,
can write on it.
yeah, exactly, no,
Okay.
that's excellent.
Thank you.
Email me
I
about
will.
that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll go back to this slide. What is it, evolution by natural selection? And then we start out with, what's natural selection? There's a difference. When a cheetah, let's say, catches a gazelle, that's natural selection. When a male mannequin, performs so that a female chooses him, that's natural selection. But it doesn't mean that it's going to lead to evolution, because there's requirements for evolution that one needs. And one of those things that, well, we're going to go over them, but it's simple. Variation in a trait, heritability, and then differential, reproductive, survival and reproduction. There's another slide coming that's already says all that. So there's actually a difference between natural selection, whether it affects survival or it affects mating success or anything like that. But it doesn't necessarily lead to evolution by natural selection. And I said natural selection is kind of an unfortunate choice. So let's say with the mannequin. And the female chooses the male because of the way he dances and the coloring and the plumage that he has. Well, it actually has nothing to do with conscious choice. We don't know what's going on in the bird's mind. So when I say choice, it doesn't imply consciousness. Okay? Just like in survival, the cheetah, well, he's chasing this gazelle, right? But it's not like the cheetah wants to eat, but the outcome is that the cheetah kills the gazelle, but it doesn't mean that there's actually selection going on, selecting this or selecting that. I wish Darwin, I should go back and talk to him. Yeah, anyway, so I want you to understand that what natural selection is. Okay, and then evolution is actually different than, evolution by natural selection is different than actual natural selection. And the difference is, as I said, if you don't have variation for selection to work on, in other words, the cheetah and the gazelle Some gazelles are faster, some gazelles are slower. Okay? Heritability. So that faster or slowness is heritable. So it's actually possible to have natural selection going on without evolution, because if it's not heritable, the trait, there's not going to be any evolution. And it's also possible, as we'll see, there's other forces out there besides natural selection. So evolution by natural selection ends up being about differential survival and reproduction based on the traits that are inherited by each individual and that are then going to be passed on to future generations. Now, is evolution restricted to biological populations? Can anyone think of where things might change, where it's not biological? You think cars can evolve? True, yeah. Why might we choose a car? What do you think?
Because there's so many different types.
Yeah, why? Why one versus another?
Because they're all like structured differently.
Okay, a little bit more specific. I mean, do you consider the price of gas?
Yeah.
Okay. One reason, so car gets so many miles to the gallon. You might consider, what else? Speed, like a Lamborghini, goes pretty fast. Terrible mileage, but gas mileage, but it goes pretty fast. Cars have all these different traits, just like organisms do. And they even get selected. Like some cars, they make a lot more of them because a lot more of them are sold. The ones that aren't sold aren't made anymore. They kind of go extinct. Okay? Now, cars aren't biological, except in the sense that we're biological and we made them. But certainly cars evolve over time. As you just look at an old car, like a Model T from back in the 30s, and you see that it doesn't, I mean, it's still basically a car, 4 wheels, steering wheel, place to, sit in the car and all that, but it's changing, and it always has been. Ideas evolve in the same way. Has anybody heard of the word meme? Meme? Nothing, okay. You might have heard like viral, a meme goes viral, okay. A meme is like a gene, but it's an idea. The latest fashion, in terms of, let's say, the kind of shoes you want, back in the day, well, now it might be a LeBron James, I don't know who he does shoes for, it might be Nike or something, but it comes out, it goes viral, that's actually a meme that spreads through the population, and also real ideas. So, for example, religion is what we would call a memeplex, like a whole bunch of ideas that are bound up in an overall idea. So things actually still evolve even though they're not necessarily living, even though they're ultimately from us, since we're living organisms. Okay. So, as far as a definition of evolution by natural selection, Any consistent difference in survival and reproduction among genotypically or phenotypically different classes of organisms within a population. Now, genotype. Again, so in terms of genotype and phenotype, that's what I mean. Genotype is the underlying genes, or alleles as they're called. Allele is a different version of a gene, and then the outward expression of those alleles. Natural selection is a modifying force. We often say descent with modification. Now, natural selection, evolution by natural selection, is the only actual mechanism that consistently creates traits or favors certain traits that match the environment better than, let's say, other versions of those traits. And when a trait is well fit to the environment, then we say it's an adaptation compared to the other traits that are out there. So let's say we have these chickens again, 3 colors, and as I mentioned this before, let's say they live in a forest where things are green. Now, I asked, which color chicken would probably survive better? And you would probably say green, okay? And so green is adaptive. It helps in survival. Now, it also might be that the chickens have, let's say, different color wattle on their head, and females like an orange wattle. So, in this case, we've got selection favoring one thing, and females, the female chicken picking the male, favoring another. It's entirely possible. So, adaptation is any trait that increases individual fitness, and fitness, evolutionary-wise, is simply an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. In other words, you want to think how much, in terms of its own genetics, is the individual contributing to the future generations. Individuals who are highly adapted to their environment are the ones that are passing on their alleles versus the ones that, in the case of the chickens, let's say the ones that are blue or orange, they're not. They're getting eaten. Okay? Now, survival is really, well, you need to survive long enough to reproduce. So let's say in here there's a player. And that player, women just can't keep their hand off of him. And so he fathers a lot of offspring, right? Now, let's say he fathers, by the time he's 21, he fathers, let's say, I don't know, 30 offspring. He's not taking care of them, he's just fathering them. Okay? Now, then you have someone else who survives until, let's say, they're 70 and they have no offspring. The main thing is the number of offspring. In terms of overall survival, in fact, the 21-year-old might be living a dangerous life. In fact, that might be one of the reasons females like him, because he's able to survive long enough to reproduce by doing risky business. But eventually it catches up with him, and one of the offspring he fathers, the husband of that woman finds out and kills him. And so even though his life ended at 21, let's say, or 22, he still fathered 30 offspring, compared to the individual who went to 70 and didn't father any. Okay? So survival is only important in terms of living long enough to actually reproduce. Okay. So let's take a look at this. Now, this is selection on survival for these beetles. The birds like the beetles. It turns out the beetles, they taste the same no matter if they're actual green or orange. But you know how we are with M&Ms. They all taste the same, but some people like the green ones or the blue ones more than the others, right? So, in this case, of course, we're looking at the background of the actual, of where the beetles, let's say, live. And it turns out the greener stand out more in terms of the background. And so over time, because the greens get eaten and don't, in other words, don't survive long enough to reproduce, the only ones that are actually reproducing are the brown ones, the orange ones. Then, so the green are being selected against, natural selection against. And eventually all you have in that habitat are the brown ones that are harder to see against the background. Now, so natural selection works on individuals, not on populations. Individuals, like the different beetles, they don't change. They can't switch from green to brown. They're kind of dealt with the cards they inherit from their parents. That's strictly all it is. They don't change at all. Okay? It's just that in this case, the brown ones have higher fitness. They survive long enough to reproduce than the green ones. If, in fact, this was a green background, the brown ones would actually stand out, and they'd be selected against. So it's not like there's ever any personal, perfect trait. Traits all are, you have to look at them in terms of the environment that they're in. Okay? Populations, though, are made up of individuals, and those individuals have inherited certain traits from their parents. And in this case, from one generation to the next, so these are different generations right here. Okay, so generation 1, 2, 3, we see that in fact the population has changed. The individuals have not. They're one or the other. It's just that the brown ones, there's fewer of them, or there's more of them at the end compared to the green ones. Okay. So, if a lion eats you, is that natural selection? Yes? No? Yes?
Yes.
Anybody know? No. Okay. If you get the girl and I don't, is that selection? No? Yes. Come on. Yes. Some say, anybody say no? No, it's yes. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? What do you think? Is that selection? Yes. Okay. Since we're organisms and we evolve just like other organisms, if a pine cone hits you on the head, is that natural selection? Yeah. It actually is. It might not cause evolution because the chance getting hit on the head by a pine cone is probably really low, and over time, the chances of having a trait or evolving a trait because of pine cone killing is rather low. So you might actually have natural selection there where it kills that poor individual, but it doesn't really, and it even changes the frequency in the population, but it's not going to be repeated very often. And no one is going to end up, let's say, with a trait that protects you from pine cones. How about if you get hit by a bus? Is that natural selection? Yes. Now, getting hit by a bus, if it's a common enough thing, eventually there might actually be, well, there's selection and there might actually be evolution. So, for example, some people have thicker skin and bigger bones compared to other people. So, if one person gets hit by a bus, that person gets squashed versus the other one gets ruined but still survives and reproduces. Okay? And then over time, in terms of this selection, evolution by selection, more people will survive and reproduce who have thick skin and big bones. And eventually we might get humans that look kind of like rhinoceroses with those big plates, right? Okay. Now what's more likely, though, in terms of evolution and buses? Anybody? Forget about the actual physical thing, like big bones and thicker skin. Think about behavior. Okay? So, what do you think about behavior in terms of getting hit by a bus? Exactly. If you're stupid and you don't look, that means that in the future there's hopefully going to be fewer stupid people. Okay? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way nowadays, does it? So, too bad there's not enough buses. Now, so we've kind of talked about what might end up evolving in this case. And we could say, well, certainly a lion eating you. Reproduction, if one individual gets a mate and the other one doesn't. Bopping on the head, yes. Pine cone, probably not. Hit by a bus, perhaps, because of behavior. Now, are humans still evolving? Who said that? How dare you? You said yes. Well, that's true. In fact, there's some recent evolution that's going on. Well, certainly there's a lot of recent evolution going on. First of all, how did our ancestors actually live for most of the time that humans have been on this planet, 200,000 years? Anybody? Do you think they lived in cities? Or did they live as hunter-gatherers or early farmers?
It evolved. It was starting civilizations, and then
Okay, so, and cities really didn't show up, or large settlements, until about 14,000 years ago. Yeah?
Oh, I was just gonna say the same thing. Start off as hunter-gatherers.
Yeah. So, we used to live in small bands, and we didn't grow our food. We went out and caught it and gathered it. That's quite a different environment than we live in now. First of all, back then, within your group, you were pretty safe. But if you found a stranger came along, most likely you would have killed him. Just because he might have been dangerous. Not because he was dangerous, but he might have been. Okay? Nowadays, of course, we run into strangers all the time and we don't go and kill them. Even though I felt like it certain times. Okay? But, in other words, the selective environment now, in terms of the people you meet and how you interact, has actually changed. You know, you used to be thought that hunter-gatherers lived kind of an idyllic life. They went out and they caught their food. But it was brutal, and also it was especially brutal because there was pretty much constant warfare going on. They didn't have the kind of weapons we do now. But it seems like they were always fighting over limited resources. As we'll see later on, how many in here can't drink milk? Okay, so you're lactose intolerant, right? Okay. And then there's a bunch who can. Well, it turns out there's a mutation that's responsible for that. Huh? Yeah, I'm sorry. And it'd be nice if you could actually change, you know, and get that gene, and be able to drink milk. But you're born the way you are, and you can't evolve. I'm sorry. Yeah, unless you get lactose-free milk. Okay, there you go. In this case, that's an example of relaxed selection. But in general, what happens is, if you think about mammals, mothers only produce milk when they have babies. And then at a certain point, the babies grow up and the mother weans them. In other words, quit bothering me, Junior. Okay? And they start eating other kinds of food that they naturally eat. Okay. So to be able to actually digest milk, you need an enzyme called lactase that cuts the milk molecule, which is actually made up of two different sugars, sucrose, or glucose, and galactose. Now, we can only use glucose singly or galactose. We can't use the whole molecule. So we have an enzyme that makes it possible for us to actually digest milk. Unfortunately, well, and that's a good thing in some cases because, well, for babies. But for most mammals, that's the last time they're going to need it, and it actually costs resources to make milk. And so why would you want an individual producing an enzyme that cuts lactose into its constituent parts so you can use it when you're not going to ever consume that ever again, for the most part. So what happens is the gene is turned off at a certain point. There's a feedback loop. At a certain point, the offspring is going to get less and less milk, and eventually that offspring is not going to produce lactase anymore, and they're lactose intolerant. Now with humans, it turns out someone had a version of a gene, an allele, that kept that gene on. It was actually not a mutation in the gene itself, but upstream that controlled it. So those are the people who now continue to produce lactase. this was a random mutation, strictly random, okay? But in cultures that were already herding animals, mammals specifically, and suddenly there was someone who could drink milk instead of just eating the animal, that person had a huge advantage. So in this case, that lactase gene that kept the lactase being produced, that person left more offspring. Okay? It turns out that nowadays humans whose ancestors grew up in a pastoral culture where they herded animals, mammals specifically, and they got milk, this mutation by happenstance occurred and it continued on. Now, there were other cultures where that didn't happen. They didn't really have animal husbandry for large mammals that produced milk. And so you have whole swaths of individuals who are intolerant of lactose. So it looks like in the Middle East and Europe, certainly, there were those cultures, and a lot of those individuals are lactose tolerant. But then individuals in the Far East or the Americas, they didn't have they weren't herding mammals. So they never had an occasion to actually come across milk they could drink. And so a lot of those individuals are, in fact, intolerant. Now, I don't know why. You should talk to your parents, though. Okay. I mean, they blew it. That's cruel, isn't it? Oh, I'm sorry. Are they nice?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because they've already put you in a hole. Okay. Now, it turns out there are requirements before evolution by natural selection can actually happen. And this is where I came in. There has to be variation in traits among individuals in the population. Like being lactose tolerant or intolerant, there's variation. This all depends on the environment, remember? So also here we've got different colored beetles, and we've got birds eating them. And they're able to eat the green ones on a tree trunk that's brown. They're more visible than the other one, right? So there has to be variation. If all the individual beetles were the same color, there would never be any way for the beetles to actually evolve unless they had a mutation that changed their color. Now, not only is there variation, but that variation has to be heritable. That means that it's passed from one generation to the next. Even if there's variation and there's selection, let's say like here, but the color isn't actually heritable, there can be no evolution. Okay? It has to be passed from generation to generation. So those individuals with traits that either help them survive and reproduce or help them reproduce better than other individuals without those heritable traits are the ones who will be producing offspring that will go, that's the next generation, and then future generations as well. Okay? And that's the only way it's going to happen. If you've started the Darwinian snails already, some of you have, that's what you're going to be looking at. And they're going to take you through, there's certain sections that'll deal with variation. You can actually see how evolution of the snails works in terms of the thickness of their shells, or also whether they're heritable or not. So if something is not heritable, there's still selection going on, even on survival, but they won't evolve. The population itself won't evolve. Now, traits that actually increase fitness, leaving more offspring, those are called adaptations. They're good for that environment. So in this case, brown beetles are adapted because starlings there can't see them on the brown background of a tree, whereas the green ones are visible. If these beetles lived on green leaves, it would be the other way around. So there's no trait that is actually better than some other trait. It all depends on the environment that it's in. Okay, so here we go. Where's the variation in this among chickens? Anybody? Huh? Long neck, right? Okay. In this case, taller is not better, right? So who's it going to be? Right? It's probably going to be him. Now, there's variation, right? There's also individuals who are shorter. Now, is this size actually inherited from their ancestors? We'll say yes, it is. Okay, so size is heritable. In humans, height is about 80 or 90% heritable. It's not by just one gene. There's probably a lot of different genes that interact that affect how tall you are. But they're certainly heritable. And then there's selection. In this case, what's the selective agent? The X, right? And the individual being selected is the individual who's tall. It would have been better to have been short in that case. And then eventually, well, you would expect if this guy was always killing tall chickens, that tallness trait would disappear from the population. Okay. So here's the adaptation. This is a viper. It's a snake. It's got camouflage skin color. In this case, not to hide from, let's say, another predator. Well, that could be, but mainly to hide from prey. Same thing with the polar bears. Also, the white coat helps them stay warmer. In this case, giraffes, adaptation. This insect, different colors, right? Versus this insect that's camouflaged for brown leaves. Each of these are adaptations in certain environments. The giraffe, if that giraffe was in, let's say, a grassland where nothing is taller than, let's say, 2 feet tall, well, there wouldn't be very strong selection for having a long neck, would there be? Also, by the way, there is something called a forest giraffe. It's called an okapi, and it looks kind of like a giraffe, but it's got a shorter neck. Okay, oops. So, the only way you actually get variation, by the way, ultimately, is from a mutation in the genetic code. Most mutations, it turns out, either have no effect, because there's a lot of the genetic code that doesn't code for doesn't code for proteins at all. Or if it does, and there's a mutation, it's most likely a bad mutation. It'll make the protein non-functional. But occasionally you can get a mutation that's actually beneficial, like the lactase gene that keeps lactase being produced. And in environments where there's milk available, it's advantageous. So having an adaptive allele, in this case the mutation, leads to a difference in phenotype, being able to drink milk or not. And these are random. It's not like parents can decide, oh, it'd be better if my offspring were this color instead of this color. And so I'll give them a gamete with a mutation. Now, just so happens that there's a mutation in the germ line that affects the color, that will be passed on to the offspring, and whether that change is actually beneficial or not depends on the environment. So, random mutations, they actually are random. It's not like an organism can think, oh, I need this kind of adaptation. Like, I would love to be able to fly. In fact, I could even say at times, I really need to fly. Flying would make my life better, and let's say I'd leave a lot more offspring. So remember that guy who died at 21? If he could have flown away before the irate husband killed him, right? It would have been good to have that mutation where he could, or in that trait where he could fly. But just the fact that it would be beneficial doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's not. It's strictly random. It's not like an organism or a species can say, oh, it's better to fly now. No. Now, eventually, obviously there are animals that do fly. So flight has actually evolved. But it didn't happen just because they needed it to happen. It happened strictly by random. And those random mutations that were beneficial were favored and went on into future generations. Now, Darwin at the time, everybody at the time, they didn't know anything about inheritance. They thought there was something called blending inheritance, where, let's say you had two different colors of water here, blue and yellow. And if you just poured in blue, you'd have blue. Just poured in yellow, but if you poured in blue and yellow, you'd end up with green. And it turns out, let's say you had a beneficial mutation. In this case, there's a new mutation for blue, where there wasn't before. Well, it would kind of be that beneficial mutation of being blue would be, in some individuals, they would have it, but it was blending. Everything would blend into green. And evolution by natural selection actually wouldn't work with blending inheritance. Now, at the same time, there was this monk in Czechoslovakia named Mendel who was working with pea plants. And he actually worked out genetics. But, and he even had a copy of Darwin's book on the origin of species. But he didn't actually realize that his patterns of particulate inheritance, in other words, an allele that produces a protein that's a certain color, let's say, that might actually affect evolution. And in fact, a particulate inheritance is the only thing that actually makes evolution possible. So Mendel's stuff was actually kind of forgotten for 50 years until the early 1900s, when someone started working on this again, and then they suddenly came across Mendel's work on pea plants. And that's when there was a huge revolution, because until that time, Darwinian evolution had a problem with this idea of blending inheritance. So once Mendelian inheritance was actually added to Darwinian evolution, suddenly we had a mechanism that actually did work. Okay. Here's another example. These are lots of examples. One is peppered moth. There were two morphs, a dark morph and a light morph. During the Industrial Revolution in England, power and heat and everything was produced by coal. So there was coal dust everywhere, and the trees around where coal was being burned became darker. Now, if you look at okay, here is a white morph on a white tree bark, where the trees are the natural color, and then here's a dark morph that stands out. So normally the dark morph would be eaten and would not be leaving its offspring and genes into the future generation. But the environment changed, and suddenly the white morph was visible and the dark morph wasn't, and this was noticed, and there were also a lot of different colored dark and white that had been collected, and the change in the frequency of the dark morph increased over time. In fact, and then now it's actually going back. But there was a fellow named Kettlewell who actually released butterflies or moths of different colors of the dark and white and light morph, and to see if he could recapture some of them. And the ones he was most likely to recapture were the ones that had the dark morph. And then he also did some work with birds and in an aviary, and which could they see better was the dark morph. Okay, so but there's also lots of evidence. Insects have developed resistance to pesticides. So a pesticide that worked in the past no longer does. In other words, there's a random mutation that allowed that individual to, let's say, detoxify that pesticide. Everybody, all the other insects died. It left offspring that survived. Same thing with herbicides, and the same thing, of course, with weeds and with diseases. So like antibiotics. That's why there's antibiotic resistance. Okay, so here we are. We have got a population of dividing microbes. They reproduce. When they reproduce, now they're not doing it by sex, they're doing it by fission, but they're still reproducing. A couple of them, when there was reproduction, there was a mutation. And so they ended up mostly still being white, but some had blue, some had red. So this continued. Now we have the blues and the reds are reproducing. There was even a new mutation of yellow. Okay. And then to this group of microbes, we add an antibiotic. It turns out the microbes are killed or prevented from reproducing by the antibiotic. So all the white microbes, all the yellow microbes, and all the blue microbes get killed by the antibiotic. But it turns out the red microbes, the red bacteria, have a mutation that allows them to detoxify or resist the antibiotic. And so eventually, in the next few generations, you're gonna have all mutants that are then resistant to the antibiotic. That's how antibiotic resistance happens. It's not that one of these microbes decides, oh, I'll turn red, because I might need to be red later on, because I'm going to need antibiotic resistance. Or that, oh, I think I'm going to turn blue. There's no, obviously, it turns out bacteria don't have brains, right? So but even if they did have brains, selection with us, it's still going on even when we don't think about it. Okay? So it's not like we have this thing happening where there's mutations because it would be beneficial. Those mutations are random, as we see. The blue ones didn't do any good when the environment changed, and the environment changed because of the addition of antibiotics. And the yellow one and the white ones, they were all not resistant. Whereas before, they were fine. You didn't need resistance. So the new environment has antibiotics. It was the red ones that actually can survive and then reproduce. And so the population changed. Those survived, the red ones, and reproduced, and eventually you ended up with only a population of resistant bacteria. So when you watch the antibiotic resistance, you notice that there were mutations. These are random mutations. There were also mutations you didn't probably even see because they were not beneficial mutations, and so the antibiotics killed that strain of E. coli. The chances of actually getting a beneficial mutation are actually pretty low. So I just want you to understand that mutations are random. It's not like, oh, an organism needs a new mutation. It may need a new mutation, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's a completely random sort of thing. In fact, beneficial mutations are generally the rarest kind. You can easily damage a protein with a wrong mutation, or have a mutation in an area that doesn't code for a protein, then nothing happens. So mutations are completely random. Okay. So, in the case of natural selection, what was the source of the genetic variation among individuals in a population? A or B? Huh? A? B. Okay, it's B. The genetic variation. Remember, some individuals had a mutation that was beneficial, some didn't. So it was a random mutation. Okay, this is pretty much what we did before, but there was variation exists in the population. Some environments favor one form, some environments favor another. These forms were heritable, and then we finally had differential survival and reproduction. So this is the same thing as the antibiotic. Which one was it? Random mutation. Okay. Now, we've been talking primarily about survival, selection on survival. But there's different kinds of selection, and that we're going to be looking at. So, we've got a zygote, which means a fertilized egg. And some of the zygotes might have inherited a mutation that was lethal. Which means that there would have been strong selection, right? The lethal, they're dead. So this is viability selection. So if you have that's why if you, oftentimes there's mutations, you end up with a miscarriage, let's say. It may not happen immediately. Sometimes the mutation doesn't really become dangerous until later on in the pregnancy. So if they make it to adulthood, those adults, they have to find another adult to mate with. If they find a mate, and there's been selection that favors their traits because the opposite sex likes those traits. If they're losers, then they may want to have sex. They'll do everything they can to have sex, but they're out of luck. Okay? So now there's selection on, it's called sexual selection. Then we've got parents, and they have to survive. Now, there's also something called fecundity selection, which is the number of offspring you produce. Now, most humans is just one offspring, sometimes two. But there's, like dogs oftentimes produce 14 pups, all kinds of different things. So there's variation in that as well. And then finally, there's also something called gametic selection. In other words, some gametes are more successful than other gametes in fertilizing eggs. In other words, some sperm are. It's called sperm competition. Now, sperm aren't thinking, oh, I better get there as quickly as possible. The ones that actually fertilize the eggs, they do. The other ones don't. And there's variation in the sperm. Some are faster swimmers. Also, if you have sperm from different males, there's competition. And some sperm produce toxins that are toxic to the other sperm. And then we're finally back to what's called compatibility selection. In other words, are the sperm and egg, are their genetics actually compatible? So there's all kinds of selection on life stages, not just survival. So here we are with this again. Another example was wherever the English went, they brought animals with them from their home country. When they got to Australia, there were no rabbits. There were, in fact, no placental mammals whatsoever. So they brought rabbits, and they released them, and those rabbits went absolutely, well, they did what all rabbits do, don't they? Until they also brought sheep and cattle, and the rabbits ate everything. And there wasn't left over for kangaroos, for sheep, whatever. So they were wondering what to do about this, and then they found a virus that was from South America that was completely lethal to bunny rabbits. It's called myxomatosis, and it basically wiped out 99.999% of the rabbits. And we can actually look at what happened. So there was natural variation because of rabbit plagues from other things. Okay, but this is myxomatosis. And you see the rabbit abundance crashed. But it didn't completely die out. There were still a few that survived. Some of those that survived actually were resistant to a certain point. They managed to survive the infection. Just like with Ebola, some individuals actually survived. Most of them didn't. Okay, so this is selection on survival, again.